For our first panel, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole Hutton from Old Dominion University so that she can introduce herself and Andre and the first panel. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Nicole Hutton. I'm an associate professor with Old Dominion University in the Department of Political Science and Geography. And I have the pleasure of working with the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, as well as their Assistant Director of Engagement with RAFT. So thank you. We are going to be doing a section on approaches to community participation to ensure equity. And to kick us off, I'm excited to introduce Mr. Andre Elliott, the Senior Executive Director at the YMCA of both the Eastern Shore Family YMCA and Northampton County YMCA. So the locations in Southampton Roads. Andre, can you unmute and go ahead and share with us?
Hi, yeah. So how's everybody doing? Yes, I'm Andre Elliott, Senior Executive Director. To make it easy, we can just say YMCA Southampton Roads, which is all encompassing for the Eastern Shore as well. But I do oversee the sites on the Eastern Shore. Just talking a little bit about what we've done with community participation with y'all's research. It's been 2 years now almost. That Cora Baird approached Karen Downing, who is my co-chair on the Community Advisory Committee here, and was looking for some folks to help put together and lead this. Karen reached out to me because I, like her, am unable to say no to anything when it comes to community projects. So much so that you just get a little overextended at times. But those are the people that you want to look for if you start to think about community projects. So Karen reached out to me. We met with Cora, Barbara Brown Wilson, Karen McGlathery, Cora Baird, who's up on this call. I don't know if Karen or Barbara is, but I met with them and kind of talked about what this was going to look like. And we were quickly bought in because Karen Downing and I have been working on a diversity, equity, and inclusion work group for Eastern Shore Healthy Communities. And this concept of climate equity fit in really well with what we were trying to do within healthy communities, with livable, walkable communities, making sure that there was equitable access for folks across our communities. This ended up being a really great opportunity. So that's how we ended up where we are. Over the last few years, what have we done? We sat down, and this was a bit of a process, and started putting together this Community Advisory Committee, which was the idea brought forth by the university, and to advise on the Coastline and Peoples Grant project of the Climate Equity and Climate Equity Atlas that we're doing here on the shore. So we put together that group. What we ended up doing was looking at who all the stakeholders were, and then we tried to get representation from each sort of stakeholder group. So you're talking about people that are traditionally marginalized communities. They're often served by nonprofits. So we sought out the director of the United Way to be on the Community Advisory Committee because we felt like there was some representation there. Businesses are some of the biggest contributors to for lack of a better way to say this, they're some of the biggest contributors to pollution, climate change, and all those things. So we thought, all right, how do we bring the business community in to have conversations about what their concerns were? And we decided that, okay, so the director of the Chamber of Commerce will be a person. So as you can see, that's kind of how we started deciding, we needed somebody from ag. We still are struggling with the person from ag, but I think we're getting there through some of the chamber connections. We wanted somebody from aquaculture. We wanted to have people from, just every walk of life. So we've got education represented, healthcare, and all those things. So this is our sort of community advisory committee that helps with the work. So that's been a really interesting process, sort of the building of the community advisory committee to help support the college. So, So then I guess my next points would go around when you, excuse me, when we first started trying to figure out how we were going to, how we're going to do this. The idea of this equity atlas was brought forth by the UVA team, and it was really interesting to us to see that the types of data that we could pull together with this atlas. And from our perspective as community members, it was really important that we have something like that to give our decision makers the best information that they possibly can have. So when they're making decisions about how they allocated resources, they can also, one, look at it from a lens of equity and inclusion and making sure that everybody was taken care of, but also two, and probably most important to the work that we're talking about, is making sure that climate factors and flooding and things like that were considered when when they were granting permits and things like that. So that's some of the stuff that we really wanted to see put forth, and it was really interesting to kind of get some of the feedback from the CAC members as we were trying to figure out how do we identify zones, like is the census tract the way we want to identify the areas that we're looking at, and and how things from a high level don't necessarily translate to the granular local level. We discovered a lot of that. So I'm going to pause for a second and go back to sort of the relationships that we've built. What's been really interesting about the project that we've been working on is that I feel like the relationship building, starting probably years and years ago with the efforts that UVA, VIMS, Virginia Tech have put into the areas on the Eastern Shore, with different projects. I think that you're starting to you see this community being more accepting of our partnerships with these universities. The staff from the universities have come and really kind of become a part of the community when they're here. One of the things I think about for me that's been most rewarding with this is that I've built relationships with the researchers and the team from UVA on this project. I find myself, wondering about how they're doing, and actually really sort of care where this work is going, because you can see the passion that these people put into it. But what's really rewarding about it is that that they're actually listening to what you're saying. They've taken the time to hear what the community's perspective is, and they don't want to just sort of shove things down our throats. And when you live in a small community like this and outsiders come in, it's oftentimes you feel like they're going to come in, they're going to try to tell you what to do, they're going to get their research and their information that they want and leave. And this hasn't felt like that at all. It feels like we're building some lasting relationships with people that care about what happens in our community and the opinions of the folks in our community. So that has been probably the number one factor in what I'm going to consider is going to be a successful project, is that the researchers, the team from UVA, everybody genuinely seems to care, and they want to hear what the community members have to say. We had last year our first climate equity workshop at the Eastern Shore Community College, and there was a lot of different stations that were well thought out. Lots of information was gathered from the community, a lot of anecdotal stuff gathered as well. Things that don't show up in reports from different government agencies. The way the climate change and climate events affected people on the ground, and it was really cool to see how our community members, we ended up having around 100 people show up, but it was really cool to see how our community members engaged with the science team and the researchers to give their feedback. And then what really well, I keep saying what really, but there's so many things about this that are great. That it's hard to contain the excitement of it all. But so from that meeting, we created a living timeline where, you know, even starting back as far as the 1800s, there's a timeline of events with anecdotal information from community members that we keep adding to use as the Climate Equity Atlas is developed. They built a couple of small timelines for folks in the community to take out to events, which I know Cora's done a couple of times. And we did one at the Juneteenth event in Exmoor, Virginia, which was back in July, well, obviously July and Juneteenth. We did one there with a team from UVA and some community volunteers, and again, got more and more information. So I guess if I were to say anything about this community engagement piece, is that just if you're looking to do this in other communities, the first thing you have to do is start to build relationships. So is there any specific questions that people want to ask about this? Sorry.
And I think there might be time for some questions after you and Nicole both are done presenting. But Andre, that was great because just to give a little background to folks who are in attendance who don't know, you know, the RAFT, we first started on the Eastern Shore, and then we moved to the Northern Neck and the Middle Peninsula, and now we're with Hopewell and Petersburg. But it's been great to circle back to the Eastern Shore with this project that Andre was just talking about, to try to continue to work with and work with the community members and sustain the resilience efforts. So that was really helpful. And I think we have, Nicole, don't we have some time after your presentation maybe for questions? Great.
Yes.
Thanks.
All right. ODU hosted another equity workshop last year. This was in November, and we sought a national audience for that. And so I have the pleasure of sharing with you today some of the lessons learned from the research and practice collaborations that we discussed during that meeting. If you could change the slide, please. Just to give you a heads up for where we're going in this presentation, first I'm going to describe the workshop to you. Then I'm going to give you a summary of the discussion points that we covered in the workshop. I will then talk about some of the recommendations that we received from our participants, some next steps, and some lessons learned that we consolidated. Next slide, please. So our interest here was in exploring equitable coastal resilience. And so in order to do that, we wanted to engage coastal communities and figure out what their thoughts were about how to conduct this research. Because I think, like Andre said, I want to reiterate, building these relationships is key to success. And so always good to ask those that you're working with what they think it is that you're proposing to work with and how they would like to see that guided. So you'll see in some of our lessons learned and recommendations that that's what we were trying to capture. Next slide, please. So this project started in July of 2022, and we convened an advisory group. We recruited speakers. We set several topics, the topics of which I will go over with you in just a moment, and figured out how to host this virtual workshop. So once we determined our invitees, we recruited those invitees up until November, when we were able to host our workshop and start our preliminary analysis. Since then, we conducted that analysis through roughly March of this year, and have been producing post-workshop materials and disseminating those since then. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Many thanks to the RAFT for allowing us to share our findings here. The outcomes that we derived are a research agenda and recommendations for research to practice. And I will spare you the research agenda today, but we will explore the recommendations for research to practice, which are a little more applied and perhaps more exciting for this group. If you are interested in the research agenda, I do have a link at the end of this presentation to our full project webpage, and you're welcome to explore anything that we have up there. Next slide, please. So we had 113 people attend our workshop. We have a map here of where those people came from. You can tell that we're based in Virginia from this map. So a lot of this was based out of our personal connections that we expanded on through recommendations from our advisory group and the participants that we were asking for. This was a 3-day workshop. So we had different attendance on both days, but roughly around 38 people per day in the workshops. And so of those, we had participation from the federal government, the state government, the local governments, academia. We had maybe a little overrepresentation from academia. 64% of us were academics. And then we had researchers and the nonprofit and community organizations represented as well. And so those percentages are listed on the side of your slide. If you want to take a look at those, we did try to get a sampling from everyone. Next slide, please. In addition to the topics that we tried to engage our participants in discussing, we were able to spotlight some existing work, including the work of the RAFT, but also work about lessons learned to assist in building trust from Dr. Davis, about setting ourselves up for success from Dr. Mosier, and about equitable recovery in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida from our colleagues at in Louisiana and with FEMA. So in addition to these, we broke people out into 7 different breakout sessions. And so on our next slide, I'm going to share with you what those breakout sessions included. We talked about various topics ranging from infrastructure planning, inclusion in decision-making, particularly the inclusion of underserved, under-resourced, or invisible communities, which include rural communities, tribal communities, low-wealth communities, marginalized communities. We also included the topic of metrics and mapping of social equity and coastal community resilience, coastal squeeze, climate migration, and equity implications, equity concerns underpinning policy analysis and decision-making. So those had to do with benefit cost analyses, BRIC funding, and flood insurance. And our last topic, although not the least, was emergency disaster management challenges for equitable mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So on the side of this chart here, we have the number of participants that engaged in each. So these participants were able to select their top few topics, and we tried to sort them accordingly. While we talked about these things, we tried to define them, to measure them, to figure out what decisions and actions were needed to make them equitable, and what instruments and tools already existed to support work towards improving the equity here. We also asked our group to help us to identify terms or keywords that are crucial elements of defining equity in coastal resilience, and you can see that word cloud on this page. And we do have on our website, if you are interested in any of the spotlights that we did, we have those recorded for you. So you're welcome to go and take a look through those. Next slide, please. All right, so in summary, we found some definitional concerns. We found that measuring equity and coastal resilience was a key component of moving forward, and that funding was needed for several things: for engaged and applied research, for communities to support on-the-ground projects and programs, for incentives, infrastructure, and institutional support for academic research, and for communities and community partners. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on these things before we wrap up. Next slide, please. So when we talk about needing definitions, some of the things that we were thinking in those recommendations are, what does equity mean in the context of coastal resilience? Who decides that definition? What does success in advancing social equity and coastal resilience look like? What does a successful engaged research or on-the-ground project look like? How do we track equity across time and space, recognizing the need for comparison while acknowledging the local context? And lastly, how do we know that we are making a difference in advancing equity while building coastal resilience? And so these questions feed into the research agenda that we developed here. Next slide, please. For the execution of this research agenda, I've highlighted here the main sort of recommendations that we received. And so at the top level, we wanted to increase funding for engaged or applied research and allow more flexible funding for research to be co-produced with communities or community partners. Now, we realize that isn't so simple. So in alignment with that, we mention this involves building long-term focus and requisite resources into funding and programs or grant requirements. This involves explicitly calling out the need for co-production and two-way engagement with communities in the requests for proposals. And funds that include action-based research and implementation of research. So back to our top level again. We also identified that we need to ensure equity in prioritizing, evaluating, streamlining, and awarding on-the-ground projects and programs that benefit underserved communities. And one of the things that we talked about in this is, what does it mean to label a community? And how does that impact that community as well as the work? And so that's something that we are keeping in mind and still looking into. So within this, we realized that to conduct equity assessments before funding programs would be ideal. Assessing the equity focus of current funding programs is something that should be done. And we need to create flexible funding application processes with reduced application and administrative burdens. So these would be simpler and reduce the cost involved in the management of these grants. And our third top level piece here in our project execution is to provide institutional support and incentives to encourage and foster community-based, engaged, and applied research. So this would involve educating university leaders and administrators on the importance of engaged and applied research, including the need for institutions to support and provide resources for them. Creating incentive structures and guidelines to recognize, reward, value, and prioritize community engagement activities, and establishing staff positions to support community engagement activities. So this would look like extension workers or engagement specialists, community liaisons, and community coordinators. Next slide, please. So for the project infrastructure, we wanted to highlight that we need to create and disseminate tools and metrics for project assessment that emphasize equity and mechanisms for collaboration building processes. And we also wanted to create paths and resources for community empowerment and advocacy. With our time restrictions, I'm going to move us forward without going into these details, but this slide deck will be provided for you later, so you can read into these a little bit more. Next slide, please. All right, so our goal in this workshop was to figure out how successful projects that incorporate applied and engaged research in coastal resilience and social equity should work. So what we think are the next steps is we need to create a framework for what community organizations should expect from the researchers and the type of partnerships and collaborations that can be pursued, to provide guidelines and best practices for researchers and community partners to use in on-the-ground projects, and to identify gaps in research and practice that can be filled by data-driven solutions. Next slide. All right, so our lessons learned are that we need to understand what equity-centered policy related to coastal resilience is. We need to learn how equity-centered policy development and program design can be encouraged. We need to learn about measures and instruments of equity-related policy outcomes, and we need to identify how equity concerns of coastal resilience policies can be sustained over time. And our last slide is a thank you to our funders. This project was funded by the Department of Homeland Security under one of their grants. And so we always want to be thankful for that. And like I said, the project webpage is at the bottom of this slide. Thank you for your time. And I think we still have time for questions for both Andre and myself.
And perhaps if people could put your questions in the chat box, and then maybe JD could flag it to us if there are questions there. I'm going to take the privilege here and just kick it off with a question to Andre, if you don't mind. You know, as we noted earlier, we started on the Eastern Shore. Now we love coming back and circling back to work further with Eastern Shore, and see Cora is here. It would be great if you wouldn't mind talking about what's really worked well and not worked well in trying to build those community relationships and build that trust. And that doesn't have to be just with this project. Without naming names, you could name prior projects, maybe if there's some examples to you of what's really worked well or not worked well in trying to engage with the community, because you all will hear that as a theme today. I think it's the next presentation as well, that building of trust is what's really required to engage fully with the community.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty easy one. I think, we talked about that building relationships and building trust. When you come into a community and you ask them what they want, and you have people here like Cora that are constantly working and advocating on behalf of universities and the programs that you do, and helping us understand them. I think that is a recipe for success. What I think goes off the rails sometimes is, again, and I mentioned this in my ramblings earlier, but when you're in a small community like this, so often you feel like organizations come in to get what they can get out of you and then leave. And I think that, again, VIMS, UVA, Virginia Tech in particular, all of you all have had lasting impacts in the community with centers and things here that go beyond that initial contact. And I think that has been, you've helped create jobs, you've brought people into the fold. And I think this works really well when people can trust the organizations and institutions, and that when you take the time to really get to know what the community is. And if you just come in and do something and leave, and we don't hear from you again, that's not good. But I imagine that Tanya can go to Tangier and have dinner with any number of people and be welcome to even folks' homes, because the RAFT team went there and actually invested in the people. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I was on a panel once with a lady from a community who said people came and studied me, and all I got was this dad blame T-shirt. It was it was that kind of sentiment. Exactly, right? You come in and study us and leave.
Elizabeth,
you don't want to be.
Sorry, Andre.
I'm so sorry. I just want to point out you don't want to be like that that thing that you come and stare at and study and leave. You don't want to be treated like a lab rat.
Right. Exactly.
Elizabeth, I was going to offer that maybe folks can raise their hand while we're having the Q&A session, and then if we don't get to your questions, maybe add your questions to the chat afterwards. But I think while we're having this, it might be easiest to identify people who have questions with the hand raising function, if you're comfortable with that. But also, please, questions in the chat if that works for you too.
I saw your comment, Chad. Tumbleweeds don't make for the best collaborative partners. Oh my gosh, that's absolutely true. Just passing through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I see some comments from Tanya and Jess. Yeah, it's a little time for reflection. Yes.
I think one of the hardest things, that Nicole's presentation mentioned at the end is how do we measure success? And I'd love Andre to take a crack at. Andre, if you could wave your magic wand and, you know, in 10 years, looking back on what's happening now in the Eastern Shore, you know, how would we know? How would we know that a difference has been made?
Well, I think, you know, so we're looking at the Equity Atlas as the tool that we want to come out of this project. And I think if you look, you know, 10 years down the road, if you can see that the Equity Atlas and the work that's come from, or excuse me, the information that's come from that is helping to affect systems, policies, and environmental change here on the Eastern Shore, and that, you know, we're using that tool to make better decisions about how we you know, how we award permits, how we designate lands, things like that. I think that that's how you see success. But it really, again, when we were in Eastern Shore Healthy Communities, our whole thing was systems, policies, and environmental change. That's what we wanted to affect, so that we can have long-lasting impact. And I really feel that if you can start to see that from where we were with the from where we are with the Equity Atlas and the work that's come from the group, I think that's going to be our indicator.
Cora, did you have a question?
Yes. So sort of jumping off of the mention, Andre's mention of Eastern Shore Healthy Communities, I was wondering, Andre, or if anyone else also wants to chime in, that would be great. If you can share some thoughts about where some of these equity conversations are already happening. I feel like part of what made you know, my ability to connect with Karen and then have Karen pull you in on this was in part because you and Karen were already part of equity discussions on the Eastern Shore, and we're doing that in a public way. So having attended a panel that you were on with Karen about equity on the Eastern Shore is what gave me the awareness of you and your names and the work you were doing and made that connection easier. And you mentioned that Eastern Shore Healthy Communities is part of the place where you were doing some of that work already. For those of us who are trying to find those connections, do you have other thoughts about the kinds of places people should be looking, or like where, you know, some of that work is already going on, so that it's easier to find connections to people who are?
Yeah, so you know, a lot of this started with the civil unrest we had after all the police shootings and the George Floyd thing, and then, you know, when all these the 1619 Project and all that stuff, like, you know, a few years ago started coming out, and all these sort of issues that weren't really major things, but like just little things that sort of added up, started coming to light, and people started understanding, you know, that they wanted to have more. And then you started realizing that, okay, you know, in this country, Blacks have been traditionally the marginalized community that had the most voice, but all these other groups, you know, the LGBTQ community, Native Americans, Hispanic, Latino, women, you know, you start seeing, you know, where all these inequities were coming still in place, and, you know, from an institution, in an institutional way, you start looking at how we do business and realizing that we, again, need to start changing those systems and policies to, you know, to make things fair for everyone. Not, you know, not that there wasn't an effort being made, but we were stagnant in some ways. So I think that kind of launched people's thinking in this direction. And, you know, let's be honest, millennials and Gen Z really helped lift that to the forefront. And, you know, whether or not you agree with everything that's going on in the world of DEI, it really is important that we recognize that it's not just the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece, but also the belonging. When people feel like they belong and they're part of the process, then it's a whole lot easier to be bought in. And while we're bringing those people along to that space of belonging, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is, you know, good for our environment, not just you know, our physical environment, but, you know, emotional and well, and mental, like, how you're dealing with people. So I think that it, again, it all came from started off with a bad place with the civil unrest, but I think we're moving into a direction of really good decision making and sort of research and diving into what equity really means. Yeah, didn't really want to bring the politics thing into it, but I'm just reading this from the chat.
No,
But it's important that we do recognize that, because for so long we were just sort of status quo, and it's been really uncomfortable. We've definitely taken some steps back in some areas, but I think in the end it's going to be good once everybody comes along on the equity journey.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And thank you for the question, Cora. Anybody else have questions? I'm hoping if you raise your hand, you come to the front of my screen. I don't see any.
I
right.
will make an observation from this work. One thing that's been really good is that I was aware environmentally somewhat as a lay person, but really having a chance to engage with people that are involved in environmental research and trying to figure out ways to make sure that we're doing this right, and that we understand what's happening in the environment around us has been really, really eye-opening. And I think that more people here on the Eastern Shore are more, and again, where we live in this beautiful area of, coastlines and farms and whatever, we've always had some awareness, but I think that we are all much better educated because of projects like this and groups like I've mentioned before that have come through. And that might actually be the most important aspect of this work, is that you really are educating people on, to a greater extent, on the environment that we actually get in our everyday lives.
That's great, because I think that's one of our goals at the RAFT, is to get a common baseline of knowledge in a community of the risks you're facing with climate change, right? And to get that science out there. So love hearing you say that.
Yeah, and it's not, and when you guys do what you do, then it's not a political talking point. It's a fact, and we can stand behind that fact and help support it, no matter what your political bent is. You can't argue with not really. Some people may try, but you can't really argue with what you're seeing every day.
Yeah. All right, I'm trying to read, Cora, your comment. Hold on. If everyone has read that, she's noting a big difference between the Equity Atlas project and our prior ones, was rather than talking to coastal people about equity, we invited in Andre and Karen because they were focused on equity and asked them to consider coastal resilience. And luckily, they were willing to do that with us. Thank you. In addition to everything else they already had to deal with. That's right. So full plates already. So thank you for squeezing us in.